Hello, and welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. My name is Pamela Cohn, and I'm so pleased to serve as the host of this podcast series. Our guest today is Sara Carnegie, Legal Director at the International Bar Association. We're going to have a lot to talk about today, Sara. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So let's start at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about your career and how you came to be working at the IBA.
Thanks, Pamela. Well, I'm a criminal barrister of background, and in fact, I still have a practicing certificate, which is renewed every year. And while I don't directly deal with clients, I like to retain that professional status and the ability to still refer to myself as a practicing barrister. I started out in chambers with a very clear focus on doing crime and working within the both prosecution and defense side of the criminal justice system. And within a short period of time, ended up joining what was then the Revenue and Customs Prosecution Office as a prosecuting lawyer, and spent a number of years there working on cases that became quite serious and quite essentially quite complex, before moving into the world of public inquiries. I took a slightly different direction at that point in time by working within other government departments, working within the Cabinet Office, engaging with the Home Office, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Defence, essentially working on quasi-criminal related matters, but in the context of a public inquiry, heading up legal teams. So I did two of those. I then became the judicial advisor to the senior presiding judge, which is a senior member of the judiciary based at the Royal Courts of Justice here in the United Kingdom, working also with the Lord Chief Justice across a range of portfolio issues, many of which were criminal justice, but some were more groundbreaking in the context of introducing cameras into the Court of Appeal and broadcasting from the courts, which was a significant and quite revolutionary shift for the judiciary in this country. Before coming to the IBA, I was the Director of Strategy for the Crown Prosecution Service. So again, retaining that quite lengthy career in government, but working with the Director of Public Prosecutions in defining criminal justice strategic aims, advising on her appearance before select committees, and working with the Attorney General as well on Attorney General's questions in government. So there was a lot of different activities and work streams within that role. It was a brand new role at the time, so quite an interesting and definitely a huge learning curve period of time. But then I was actually headhunted to come to the IBA. So it wasn't an organization that I'd ever heard of. And certainly my experience up to that point had never really touched on corporate law, commercial law in any sense. So quite a different direction, but a real appealing one to me to learn something new and to try something different. So yeah, I now head up a team of lawyers. I've grown that team over the last 5 years since joining the IBA. And we work on big international projects of relevance to our members being both law firms, individual practicing lawyers, and bar associations. And we have 190 bar associations around the world. So it's a pretty significant audience. And the portfolio of work we have in the team, it goes from anti-corruption to artificial intelligence, and then across issues like gender and diversity and behavior and well-being in the workplace, through to climate change and business and human rights. So we're covering really broad and big issues that are of relevance to most, if not all, legal professionals out there.
And you said you've been at the IBA for 5 years?
Nearly 6, actually, but yeah,
time
has flown.
So
Yeah.
Tell me, from your perspective, what role do you think the legal profession can and should play in helping society move to a more equitable, just, and sustainable place?
I mean, that's a really good question, and one that we've been grappling with across a range of different project work streams, which are interlinked. We've been looking at the role of the lawyer in the kind of broadest sense of the question for about the last 3 years, off the back of a number of international stakeholders criticizing lawyers, essentially looking at where there had been scandals or issues of facilitation or enablement identified and highlighted by the media or by other NGOs with a particular interest in that field. So you can go back to the Panama Paradise Pandora Papers and looking at the role of the lawyers as flagged there, both in a criminal context, but also in that ethical grey area context. And then you had reports that were issued by international bodies such as the OECD, the UNOCD, the UN FACTI panel, not the OECD, the UNOCD, but those two reports that came out on the same day, in fact, were both criticizing lawyers and referencing to them as enablers who facilitated illicit financial flow. So, we were coming from a place of seeing an increased focus on the profession and the role it was playing in creating an imbalance in terms of attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. And as an association, I think it felt essential that we looked at those criticisms and we decided how to respond, and perhaps not to just respond in the form of typical defense by saying, we're going to rebut those assertions, we don't accept them, but actually to be a little bit more sanguine and to try and decide, well, actually, what is going on here? It's more than a few bad apples. There is a very significant grey area of activity in which lawyers can play a key role and have enormous influence. And that responsibility can contribute to a more or less sustainable, equitable, and just society. And of course, that consideration applies not just in the context of illicit financial flow, which was the subject matter of those particular studies, but also in the context of how are they applying the issues around climate change? How are they thinking about the way in which they work when looking to create a non-disclosure agreement in certain situations, or engage in what might be perceived as aggressive litigation that could be perhaps going beyond their role and perhaps not seen as entirely just in the context of the matter in hand. Perhaps slaps is a good example of that, using suppression strategies in order to bully opponents into silence and thereby suppressing freedom of speech and journalistic issues. So there's the whole raft of ethical areas in which lawyers play a part that really became clear to us ought to be under the spotlight. It wasn't purely just in relation to the reports and the issues that we were seeing 2 or 3 years ago.
And is that how the Gatekeepers Project got started? And tell us a little bit more about the Gatekeepers Project.
Yes, I mean, we launched that in summer of 2022, very much as a response to those reports that I've mentioned, and also to the widespread criticism of the role of lawyers and law firms following the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the mass exodus of firms from Russia, and actually looking to see, well, lawyers and law firms are capable of making decisions in certain instances where they feel the reputation of their brand could be at risk. And therefore, there are certain moral decisions that are being made that aren't legally required. So it kind of felt like we were in a situation where, well, what suits the law firm and the lawyer in this context is going to be a commercial interest as much as a potential ethical question. And should we translate that in a much more clear-cut way into how lawyers are making decisions and the sorts of considerations that they should be having in their toolkit of thoughts and processes? And so with that in mind, we started the project with a view to creating a dialogue, in effect, between the different types of stakeholder. It wasn't purely an echo chamber in which we were expecting lawyers just to reinforce their own approaches and activities. And I think it's fair to say we didn't have answers necessarily at that stage. We wanted to acknowledge there was an issue, and we wanted to acknowledge that the global profession needed to talk about it and to try and come up with some solutions to essentially improve our standing and our reputation if in fact there was a genuine belief that it had been compromised over recent years. I mean, lawyers have never been popular, really, but it was felt that there was a real shift towards saying, actually, is self-regulation working? For example, lawyers are essentially becoming business entities that are furthering their own interests, becoming immensely wealthy, but not towing the line that we've seen business towing over recent years since the introduction of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, for example. So where are the synergies here between what lawyers and big law firms are doing and what business is doing? How can we use that interplay between the client and the external legal advisor to perhaps create the momentum in which a more, I mean, I struggle to say this without potentially sort of creating enemies, but a more integrity-based profession can be seen emerging. And ESG provides the framework, I believe, within which that can happen.
And so where are you in that project now? And what is the ultimate outcome? Like, when will you know you're finished with the Gatekeepers Project?
That's a good
Maybe
question.
there is no
I don't
end
think we'll ever be finished. I think it's an ongoing project. I mean, there are several things here. We did produce, and I'm really delighted and proud of it. We produced an updated version of the business and human rights guidance for lawyers, which was endorsed by our IBA Council, which is a significant body back at our annual conference that met last year in Paris. So that was endorsed. It's now an official IBA document, and that's essentially a relatively abridged document that gives guidance to lawyers on why should they care about business and human rights, what does it matter, how is it relevant to them, and cites the development in both hard law, references of course soft law, but then uses a few case examples as to how the direction of travel looks. So that was one good piece, and we've actually just done the same thing with our guidance to bars. So there's the piece that is applicable to lawyers and law firms, and then there's the second document which is applicable to what bar associations and law societies should be doing. And that was just passed in our annual conference this year, a few weeks ago. So we now have both official documents updated and providing a useful starting point and foundation for essentially all the lawyers in the world, should they choose to use it. And we've had the first of those translated so far into about 7 languages, which is our intention to make it accessible to as many as possible. And our aim really with them is to try and really drive a better approach to the practice of law through the lens of business and human rights. And we've got some exceptionally long-standing experts who've worked with us on those, including John Sherman, who worked very closely with John Ruggie in the formation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and Stefan Brabant, again, a sort of luminary in this space. So it's really been drafted by the absolute kind of vanguard of expertise in this space. So those are 2 documents that emerged really on the business and human rights side. With regard to how we think about the ethical codes of conduct, perhaps, we ourselves at the IBA had a 10-strong principled guide, which was, well, it came out a number of years ago, but it gets periodically reviewed. And one of the principles expressly refers to what's the role of the lawyer in the context of client advice, and specifically says and remains saying that the client interests are paramount, subject always to there being no conflict with the lawyer's duties to the court and the interests of justice, to observe the law and to maintain ethical standards. So, we were looking at the commentary beneath that. It proved to be extremely challenging to come up with an enhanced or a more detailed explanation as to what that meant. And we received a lot of resistance from some jurisdictions, and I won't go into it now, but I think there were some countries that felt that was a very difficult line to maintain. And I guess the key question really comes down to what interests are paramount when operating as a lawyer. And what we uncovered were real variations in different countries' ethical codes of conduct, which to me is a real problem when you're practicing law across boundaries, across borders. You've got lawyers advising for a firm that has its offices in multiple countries, but there might be a different ethical red line from one regulatory code in one country to another. And that begs the question, well, how do you overcome that? Has anyone ever really thought about the implications of that in the context of client advice and how you may kind of configure your policy as a law firm? So that's the second piece of work, and we held a Chatham House event in July to talk about that. And there's a link to the report, and that came out in September. So in essence, saying that there are a number of things that we can continue to do, including continuing the dialogue, continuing to engage with civil society and governments, and perhaps looking at individual areas of focus to come up with best practice and guidance on what that might look like, whether we're talking about, money laundering, corruption, SLAPPs, NDAs, all of these different areas where ethical dramas and issues arise, climate, of course, as well.
So you mentioned those reports, and then this recent one, there's a link. All of these are available on the IBA website, I would assume.
Yes, the Chatham House report, not yet. We're yet to issue the formal press release, but it will certainly be, and I can send you and you can make available the Chatham House report link.
Okay.
So we can do that afterwards, yeah.
Perfect. So you just started to touch on climate and sustainability. So tell me, what are you seeing as the hottest trends in sustainability right now in your work?
Well, as I mentioned, we've been working in this space now, particularly enhanced with a lawyer in my team that has been attending the last two COPs, and we are looking to attend this year in Azerbaijan. And our key focus is trying to convey the message that lawyers need to be climate conscious in their advice to clients and in their decision making. So how do they think about the climate issues, no matter which area they're practicing? And of course, some are going to be inevitably much more poignant than others. But how can we ensure that the legal profession as a whole trains its lawyers to understand enough about climate change, biodiversity loss, business and human rights, and other key ESG considerations, to understand how they're connected and how they translate into legal risks and opportunities for their clients, and to try and essentially help convey those issues within new types of contract, for example. And there's model contract clauses being worked on by Chancery Lane Project, for example, which we've worked closely with across a really wide range of legal areas. And also the ABA has been doing a lot of work in this space, American Bar Association. So I think it's around, how are you helping the client operate in that sustainable, equitable way and safeguard against the legal and reputational risks to future-proof companies in the longer term? And that's a real sort of message that we're trying to deliver through the collaboration of a number of bars, attending COP and holding sessions, holding half-day symposiums with local law firms to really try and enhance the understanding of the role of law in this space, which has not really been a key theme for COPs up until now. We've been a kind of limited player in that space, but have certainly managed to get events in the blue zone, which is a good start. So yeah, we're seeing that coming through as being a more powerful focus for bars. And in fact, the IBA has created its climate registry, which is again available on its website, which tries to collate what different bars and law societies are doing around the world to issue climate statements based on, in fact, the origin story of this was the ABA's statement back in 2019. And then that followed fairly soon by the IBA issuing its high-level statement. And since then, we've seen a number of countries that have themselves adopted something similar. And some have gone quite far. The Law Society of England and Wales issued their statement and then followed up with quite groundbreaking guidance to their members on how to incorporate climate-related considerations and risk into their practice area, both in terms of how they advise clients, but also in terms of their own operational considerations.
Which is one of the things that gives me hope. But for my final question, I want to ask you, given all this very big work that you're doing and all the challenges that we're facing, what gives you hope?
I think seeing the direction of law, both domestically and regionally, so looking at the what's been going on with the EU and obviously the directive and the direction of travel there, looking at the increasing number of lawsuits that are taking place, or just transition litigation perhaps, which is hoping to enhance climate change adaptation and or mitigation, which we're looking to see expanding. And that's important to see the direction of travel which we're witnessing, and hoping that will then influence how obviously lawyers are advising their clients. So these legal developments give me hope, because I think while things remain soft law, there is always an ability to kind of work around it. I mean, obviously, a good lawyer should still be taking that into consideration, and it should be front and center of how they're advising their clients. But you still see in some jurisdictions the classic pushback. Well, if it's not direct law, then we do what's best for our client, which can translate as, well, we'll work around that pesky soft law because it's in the way. And that's, I think, seeing this kind of crystallization of that, seeing the expectation around investment that ESG is really a key consideration and a key risk area, that's important. And you know, we'll obviously have to see what happens in the States in a couple of months' time, because certain administrative changes could lead to different directions. But certainly within Europe, I remain optimistic that we're in a good, well, we're going to be in a good place.
Yeah, I believe that as well. And I believe that what is happening in the EU and the UK are great examples of what the rest of the world can and should be doing. And we're just lagging a little bit behind, but hopefully we'll get there. Thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you so much for all the really great work you and your team at the IBA is doing.
Thank you, Pamela. I'm really honored to have been asked, and it's great to see you again.
Take care.